Oh hey, it's Wes, and today's a big day. We're having a look at the new Ugreen NASync DXP4800 Plus. It is one of many NASs that Ugreen is bringing to market very soon, and they're really looking to shake up the whole NAS game. The first thing we're going to look at here, this is a 4-bay NAS, 4 hard disk slots, 2 M.2 slots, upgradable RAM, upgradable lots of stuff. Let's not get ahead of ourselves though. We're going to start with the build quality as always. First thing you notice getting this out of the box, this is a hefty beast because we're looking at a unibody aluminum chassis, just beautiful.
Speaking of getting it out of the box, let's quickly go through my hardware setup of this.
On the bottom here, we have our slot for our RAM and our M.2 slots. And this is one of the issues that I have with this build. In this slot, it's not receiving cooling from the main fan and cooling system. And so the M.2 sticks have these massive heat pads on them. A little bit sticky coming up because of those heat pads. Comes with them, and thankfully it's stuck to the door and not the M.2s. If I decide to upgrade them later, I won't have a big problem on my hands. Again, I've got 2 sticks of RAM in here, which comes with a single 8 gig stick, which is enough for 99% of things here. We'll talk more about that later on. I wanted to see what happened if you maxed out the RAM on this, and at this point the answer to that is not much. There we go, got that sealed back up. Screwdriver came with it. On the front here, we have our usual slots for hard drives. So you can lock, unlock, press this button, slides out easy. Some people don't like these plasticky drive sleds. I quite like them. They are toolless, they just snap right in, super easy, lock down, slide it back in. You don't have to use any screws. This is going to be sitting on a shelf. I don't see why it's necessary to have anything more complicated than that going on here. On the front here, you see you have lights for LAN and each disk. Kind of wish that there was a light for the M.2 disks as well, just, you know, for the sake of completion. SD card slot, 10 gig USB ports, 2 of them. Then, around to the back here, we have our giant fan, which unfortunately mine has developed a squeak. That's what it sounds like. We have 2 peripheral USB 2.0 ports, 5 gig USB 3.2 port, HDMI that works great for 4K playback, a 10 gig and a 2.5 gig port. I don't know, the 2.5 seems unnecessary to me at this level, because the 10 gig will go down to 2.5 if necessary. Once we talk too much about the specs, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but overall, the build quality of this, I think it's fantastic. Just the strange placement of the M.2 slots out of the way, out of the cooling, and the squeaky fan, I've got to bring that down to a 9 out of 10 for build quality, which is still higher than anyone else in the market. Most of them are kind of little cheap server rigs. Next up is hardware features and specs. And this is where this thing just goes crazy. This particular one has a Pentium Gold 8505 processor, which, if we have a look at our CPU mark scores, is twice as fast as the competition. Like, not just a little faster, over twice as fast. Along the Ugreen lineup, we've got a little bit of complication here with regards to what has what processor. Just one step down from this, the 4800 Not Plus has an N100 processor, which is more in line with the competition. And I feel like at that point, why would you bother? This is really the one to get because you have that great processor. You've got the 10 gig Ethernet port, which is a huge feature to me. With the 4 hard drive slots and the 2 M.2 slots, you can load this up to 96 terabytes of storage. But I wouldn't recommend that because then you don't have redundancy. With redundancy, currently I have 4 4 terabyte hard disk drives in RAID 5, so I'm getting 12 terabytes of storage. Plus, I have the two 1TB M.2s in a RAID 1 so that I can do some hot editing on there. Now, normally people would put those M.2s in an SSD cache for the hard disk drives, but I prefer my editing over the network to be a little less crazy than, you know, punching in and out of hard disk drives. Much simpler, much faster, less latency if you're just working exclusively off a separate volume, which surprisingly enough, you can already create separate volumes on this in the software. We'll talk about software later. One big reason to put more RAM in this, when this RAM can go up to 64 gigabytes, whereas the one step below this only goes to 16, that 64 gigabytes can work as a great cache for your hard disk drives as well. So where the Asus Store 5404T has 4 M.2 slots, it has a much lower RAM limit. So we already talked about the I/O here. We've got high-speed SD, 10 gig USB on the front, 5 gig USB on the back, 10 gigabit Ethernet, which at this price point is wild. Nothing else does that in this market segment. And that is specifically what I was looking for. I've been editing off the Asus Store 5404T that has dual 2.5 gig ports, which is fast, but when you're dealing with link aggregation and it's just complicated, and you're liable to get errors and difficulties with IP allocation and networking. Anyway, using a single 10 gig port is just mwah. We're going to talk about how that performs in a later segment though. So if we compare this CPU to the competition, as you can see, miles ahead. Fantastic. But what does that give you? Well, that enables some software features that a lot of these don't have, and we'll talk about that in the software section. So this one has the Pentium Gold, whereas the higher end ones get an i3, i5, and an i7 processor, which is crazy. And that will, in the future, in theory, allow you to do some virtualization and some crazier stuff on this that the other ones just aren't capable of. Also, it lends us some fantastic 4K playback, so if you put a MP4, MP5 files on this, you can plug in the HDMI and control it with your phone, and it works fantastic, perfectly smooth playback because the GPU on these Intel chips, they're later gen, and the GPU is much better with that sort of thing. So all in all, this clearly outguns everything in its class. It's a 10 out of 10 for hardware specs and features. Software, this is where things get complicated. Other reviewers have mentioned that it seems a little bit incomplete, and yeah, sure, it seems that way. I've got Chinese characters that I can't get rid of in the software suite. I have reviewed pre-release stuff before, and normally the software is so half-baked that it's just barely usable, and the company's like, ignore that error, ignore this one, ignore that. If you press this button and stand on your head, it might start. None of that. I've had no crashes, no freezes, no network issues. It's just missing a few features and has a few rough corners in like the UI. And we even have the mobile app is already all done and working great. In the mobile app, you can browse the files, you can control the HDMI output, you can browse the photo gallery, which is something that we need to touch on here. Because we have this powerful processor, it can do stuff on board that others can't so easily do. It does scanning of your files, text, facial recognition, and sorting of your photos. And it's just getting started, and this is in the early release of the software.
All right, let's take a quick overview of the software as it stands right now. As I said before, this is a rapidly developing software suite. First of all, you have your file manager, which, well, it is what it seems to be. You can go through and look through all your documents. No surprises there. So in mine, I have it set up into 2 different volumes, and if you want to create a folder on a certain volume, you just create the new folder and you choose which volume it's going to be on. Volume 1 is my SSD volume, volume 2 is my hard disk volume. So I call that my cold storage on the hard disks, a little bit slower in there. And my fast one, that's where I have my photo editing files. And then also have the photo storage, which is where I keep the photos. Now I don't have to obtusely scroll through it in here. There's also a photos program, so we'll look at that later. Our control panel, where you find all of your settings, user management, file services. I'm using SMB, not the other stuff here. We look at our network settings. This is where Hardware and power, not a lot of settings here, but this is where you set up your UPS connection, the options for that.
One important item of note, if you are setting up a NAS, make sure you have it plugged into a UPS. This is all about data redundancy, using RAID, and making sure things are safe and in multiple places. You do not want this thing to be writing and sorting information on the drives and suddenly lose power. With this, you can plug one of the USB ports into a UPS, which is a common feature for these things to have, and if the UPS senses a power failure, it tells the NAS to finish up what it's doing and then shut down. That is the safe way to keep your data safe. And also the UPS will just create another barrier between electrical issues outside of your house and the NAS data itself.
Automatic updating, you can check for updates, quickly install them. And since we have a dedicated SSD boot disk in here, there's actually a hidden third M.2 slot. The updates and the operating system are very snappy. Go to our storage manager here, where we get to see everything that is connected inside here. We have our 4 hard disks and 2 M.2s. Storage management, we have our 2 storage pools, volume 1 SSD, volume 2, which is our hard disks. Disk management. We have health tests set for both of the volumes, and we can get a warning if there is a bad sector. We have a notification center that pops up here. And were I to add on some external storage, that would be there. App Center is where this is basically our app store. Not a lot of stuff in here yet. That's one of our biggest disadvantages. This is everything that's available. But since they've recently added Docker, you can search for Docker images and containers in here and install them. It's just a little less user-friendly. Log Center with all of our log events. Don't need to play with that. Support Center. Task Manager, which is very pretty, but I prefer things to be a tiny bit more granular. I mean, it is still pretty good. As you can see, my memory is completely full just because I've been doing a lot of work on it, so it's built up a healthy cache in there, even though I have 64 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. Universal search, everything in here is indexed. So everything can be nice and easy to find. Version manager, since this is set up on BTRFS, you can do versioning. I haven't gotten into that, and I probably won't. I'm not sure yet. Sync and backup, where you can choose to sync between drives on network or outside of your network. Security manager, now I don't have any cloud stuff enabled on this. They wanted me to test that. I don't know. I don't trust cloud capabilities ever since a lot of the exploits that have come out. And here is our photos gallery. Now I have this on the hard disk volume just so it wouldn't take up space, since I have fairly small M.2 drives installed for my editing. I wanted to leave myself all the space possible there. So even though this is on hard disk drives, it's still fairly snappy. I'm sure this would populate much more quickly if I had it on the M.2 drives. And I put quite a few photos in here, as you can see. But I need to show you the cool things in the software here. We have a powerful processor, so we can do AI image recognition, which involves facial recognition. So I named a few of these. Some of them are not named. As you can see, I have pictures of a lot of people going on here. Now, is this the best facial recognition? No, it's a little bit behind, like iPhoto, well, macOS, iCloud Photos, and Google Photos, but again, we're still in early software here. And as such, I am pretty impressed. I need to start metadata tagging the location of my photos. Up here, we have just a quick little readout of our status. Task Center, no tasks ongoing. Notification Center, already showed you. Here's my user. That looks very Macish right there. And there you have it. Pretty simple, pretty snappy. I like it. And I can't wait for them to add more features. Alright, and here is our app, which as you can see, as I said before, it is very rich in data and features already. And a lot of this stuff is very familiar, and it all works very well, very snappy. There is barely anything missing from this app that is in the desktop app, which is interesting to me. Let's have a look at our photos from the phone. If anything, it's even faster from the phone app. Albums, people. And you can do just about anything on here. Reboot, shut down, check the temperatures, the speeds, the feeds, it's all in here.
But we are missing the massive app catalogs that a lot of other manufacturers have, just crazy third-party integrations. They recently added Docker support, however, so it looks very promising for that stuff to come out. The Docker support seems to be kind of early stage because it's still a little bit more manual installing those Docker-based apps than it is on some other software systems. And one of the biggest issues that I have in the software is that you cannot enable jumbo frames. So if you're working over a 10 gig network, which I am, we're not getting great performance. And we're going to touch on that more in the next section, networking performance. And hopefully that is the only issue there. Since we have enormous processing power, once they can sort that out, it should work fantastically because 10 gig connections do take a lot of processing power. This also has cloud connectivity built in so that you can contact this from away, and you also have the ability to set up separate users with separate permissions to separate volumes and drives and folders, which is great. I wouldn't have expected that to be in there this early on in the game, and it's already there. Another thing to note is a lot of the incumbent or legacy NAS manufacturers, their ecosystem has become incredibly splintered. You have tons of different mobile apps for different specific functions and different desktop apps. This one, they're trying to keep everything very slick and integrated, and it's working fantastically. The mobile app works great, and all the features are in there in an easy to digest sort of way. This is clearly still in active development. I am hugely hopeful, hugely optimistic for this, because I mean, Ugreen's been around for a while, they make a ton of stuff, but this is a big dive for them. And just speaking on that subject as well, had they made just one NAS, I would have had some doubts about this whole Kickstarter thing, but they're releasing multiple NASs. They have invested so much time and money in this already. It's not just one box, it's an entire ecosystem. It's the apps. It is multiple NASs. I feel like there's no turning back for them at this point. So although we're starting out with a Kickstarter, I have a great deal of faith in that. As it is, the software, yes, it still needs some work. I'm going to give that a 6.5 out of 10. For now, I'm going to have a link in the description to the ratings database, and as things progress, we're going to be updating that. So if things change, that'll change. Networking performance. This is where things get really tricky for me to rate because, yeah, we've got the 10 gig port, and another great thing about this is the way that it sits on the network with just a great degree of stability and permanence. When I'm using my Asus Store NAS, if I switch from Wi-Fi to hardwired or anything changes in the network atmosphere or just enough time goes by, I have to reconnect to the NAS. And sometimes it takes a couple tries to do that. It's kind of finicky. And that probably has a little bit to do with the link aggregation that's going on in the back with the two 2.5 gig ports. But this thing, the Ugreen, it's rock solid on the network. Additionally, when you go to first set it up, or if you change IP addresses or do any network reconfiguration, it's done. It's there. It is present. Whereas the other NASs, they take time to get situated, and the Asus Store, for some reason, it can take over an hour to find itself a new IP address, which is just ridiculous. Whereas this one, I was worried that I would have some issues with that, but It is very simple and easy to set up on the network. It assumes its place. Now I do recommend going into your router and going into this and assigning it a fixed IP address. It's a little more advanced, but that is something that you should do with a NAS just to save conflicts.
And one item of note, this video was edited over a 10 gig network on this NAS from my MacBook, and I encountered 0 issues in that. It worked great, snappy, perfectly stable.
And now we have to talk about the biggest problem with this NAS, is that we are operating off of a 10 gig port, yes, but I cannot get this to leverage more than 4 gigabits per second. And that is a huge disappointment for me. So even with a huge amount of RAM, with a separate M.2 SSD volume, no matter what I do, I can't get more than about 500 megabytes per second to this when I should be able to get over 1,000, which when I'm doing 4K video editing and ingesting hours of footage for client projects, that's great to have. So I'm hoping that once they finally enable being able to select jumbo frames, that might be able to work itself out. And that is one of the reasons why the software got such a low score, because they still have some work to do on the software and the firmware side to make the networking work the way it's supposed to. But even as is, this is still giving you higher availability, speed, performance of anything in its class because of that 10 gig port without link aggregation. It's acting like a 5 gig port right now, which again, nothing in its class has. For something with an integrated 10 gig from the other manufacturers, you're looking at $1,500. And even that one has a processor that's half the speed of this one. For networking performance, it's impressive, still needs some work, it's an 8 out of 10. Value. This is also complicated because we're starting with a Kickstarter. The price of this right now on the Kickstarter is $454 US. After the fact, it'll be $700. At $454, the value proposition here is insane, but I don't want to rate it based on that. I want to rate it based on what it's going to be long term. So we're going to say $700. If you don't want to get in the Kickstarter thing, you want to wait, it's going to be $700. The non-plus version of this is $600. Again, I don't recommend that. Go for the plus. Let's look at the competition. We have the two most popular ones in the market, the QNAP TS464, it's $590. And there we're looking at 2.5 gig ports, we have two M.2s, and our CPU is rated at 4098 on CPU Mark, whereas this one, 9405. Synology DS923 Plus is $600, obviously in direct competition. We have Ryzen R1600 processor, only dual core, CPU mark of 3365. Whoa, getting trounced. And that only has 1 gigabit Ethernet ports, 2 of them, but and it has 2 M.2 slots, which I feel like they would not be leveraged at that network speed. Looking at Asus Store, I have the 5404T, which is $530. That has a Celeron processor that scores 4058 in CPU mark, dual 2.5 gig ports, 4 M.2 slots. It's a great rig, but again, the network performance is a little bit unpredictable, and again, the overall performance isn't quite there. And then very similarly, there's the Asus Locker Store 4 Gen 2, which is $610, a little bit more professional. 4 M.2 slots, again, just dual 2.5 gigs. I was hoping when they came out with that new Locker Store, they would add a 10 gig port, but they didn't. Missed opportunity there. Honestly, I have no idea how Ugreen is putting a 10 gig port in these for this price point. 10 gig networking is expensive. Then some other things, there's a QNAP TS431X3, which some people would say has a 10 gig port, but what it has is a 10 gig SFP Plus slot. So you're looking at like $50 to $75 to put your own 10 gig SFP module in there. And so that's gonna be like $610. But the CPU in that is a Cortex A15, which is not there. I would be shocked if the 10 gig performance would even work on that with a processor that slow, just in managing and ingesting data. And then there's the QNAP TVS472XT, which is what we can really compare this to. We have 4 drive bays, 2 M.2 slots, Intel i3 processor, still only 5274 on CPU mark, but it has a 10 gig port. It is $1,500. Oh. For the price, for the value, I have to give this For the final price, a 9 out of 10. For the Kickstarter price, it's an easy 10 out of 10.
And that will, all told, give us a total score of 86%. Let's see how that stacks up against the competition here. Some of these are kind of guesstimates because I'm still just getting into the NAS reviewing scene here, but we can compare it very stringently against the Asus Store 5404 in the ratings here.
What do you think about this wild new business venture from Ugreen? I personally have a ton of Ugreen products, chargers and cables, and I've learned to trust them. But this is a big step for them, and they're starting with a Kickstarter, which is frustrating. Other people have harped on that. Would you buy into a Kickstarter from an established brand like this? Let me know down in the comments below. There's going to be a link in the description. I don't know if it's even going to be an affiliate link or not. If you have any questions about the new Ugreen lineup, let me know. I'll get back to you in the comments, and hopefully I'll be able to try out one of the more interesting ones from them, such as the M.2 only chassis with a 10 gig slot. Till next time, let's go take some photos and keep them safe.